from Hardie to Tony Benn. And I'm going to see if I can now move on them to the next one. Oh yeah, there we go. So the points that I'm going to cover and explain to you, I'm going to have a little introduction. Then I'm going to address the question, what is Republican Labour? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about loyalists and Republicans, and a little bit about the distinction, which we've been discussing in the group, about the distinction between Republicans or republicanism and anti-monarchism. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what was going on before the Labour, because I go into a little bit of history, like what was going on before the Labour Party was founded, and a little bit about republicanism in the early Labour Party. And I'm going to sort of end at Hardie in 1901. Now there's a big space to go with that. Okay, so those are the kind of points I want to cover. I did say to Carol, but we're not going to do it this time, that maybe on another occasion we might do these breakout groups and try to involve the audience more, if we in discussing things. But at the moment we'll stick with me just giving this little talk. And I'm going to I've got one more slide, okay, as an introductory slide, but it's the one you may have seen. But for me, it gets down to a lot of what we're going to see. I should say that I will just make the comment that Tony Benn's important in this story, but I'm not even going to mention him. But hopefully some of my comrades will say a bit more about Tony Benn when we're coming up to date. So I'm going to my next and final slide, and then I'll go back to ending the screen share, hopefully, is this one. It's the one that went out with the message, and it's got a quote from Tony Benn on it. And if you didn't look at that quote, just saw the advert, generally speaking, there's Boris bowing his head to the Queen. But to me, when I just dug that quote out when Tina was doing the advert, I thought that's a really great quote for getting at where the problem is. So I really like this quote, and we managed to get it on there. So I'm just going to go through it just in case comrades hadn't read that bit when they got the advert. It says, and this is Tony Benn speaking, he says, we're told that power has moved over time from the throne to the House of Lords, and then from the Lords to the Commons, and then from the Commons to the people. So that's a story that we've got, that sort of over time we've become more and more democratic and the power's passed over to us. That's the story that we're told. It's a kind of national story. But Tony Benn says, in practice, he's saying that power's gone in the opposite direction. In practice, power has now moved to the Prime Minister, who then, exercising the power of the Crown, without explicit consent from Parliament, dominates the whole system. And it's a point I made before when I used the word King Boris, because when we're looking at the Queen and thinking, well, the Queen hasn't got any power, what's the point in getting rid of her? We're forgetting the point that Tony Benn is making here, which is completely right, that the power, kingly power, as it were, is in the hands of King Boris. He's not actually king, obviously, but King Boris in the sense that he assumes the role of king. But at the end of the day, in that picture, he's bowing his head to the ultimate person whose very existence, even if she doesn't do anything particularly, whose very existence, the whole system of power depends. Now, most people in the country see the first part of Benn's quote, which is why they don't think we need to be Republicans, to be absolutely honest, because we've got the power anyway. As opposed to seeing the second part of Tony Benn's quotation, which tells us that, we haven't really got power at all. Under this system, we're sort of excluded from it. And that's the problem. So in a way, our democracy is a little bit of a myth, or a myth, really. It takes the form of it. And the two things that convince us that we're a democracy is Parliament and the Queen. Now think about that, seems a bit odd at first. Parliament, because that seems to be where the democracy takes place. And the Queen exists by saying, I've got no power. So you can look at the Queen and think, well, that's marvelous. She hasn't got any power. Therefore, that's another reason why we're a democracy. It's the powerlessness of Her Majesty that helps to remind us that we really are a democracy. So she exists in it's a slightly contradictory way, because how can an unelected person convince us that we're a democracy? But it's by convincing us that she has no power whatsoever. Now, the purpose of this talk is not to go into this. The purpose of this talk, we hope that in future discussions, we will look more into what we mean by republicanism, and we'll look at the role of the state and power. So this is a future story to be investigated. But to me, Tony Benn got to the essence of the problem in that quote, and therefore it's a very useful quote. Now, so that's kind of by way of introduction, but the first thing I did want to say was that in the group, we've done a short position paper called Republican Labour, and we've done it as a draft, and we've discussed it a bit, but I think, we'll probably want to amend it or even change it a bit. But the idea was to do a position paper and then at some point circulate it to all the members of the LLA so that they can join in bringing in criticisms and other things into it. So we want to try to collectivize what we're learning. And we hope that our final report will be maybe a few position papers, Republican Labour #1 being just the first of these. And we hope that we can produce some kind of report eventually that the whole LLA can discuss and maybe get some policy out of it. So in this talk, I'm not really going to talk much about republicanism. Well, I've just done it now, so I've passed that over. But by and large, I'm not going to talk about republicanism because it's like an assumption that we already know what that means. We all understand what Republican is, and it's a bit like the word socialism. We all know what it means, but when you dig into it, then it gets more complicated. But we're going to take it first of all in this talk as being somehow unproblematic, and I will say why that might not be the case. But the LLA is not going to bring republicanism into the Labour Party from the outside, but what we're doing here is merely highlighting what is already there. But what we're going to do is try and develop a critique of the weakness of the Republican Labour tradition in order to develop ideas and policies which are, let's say, stronger and more robust and capable ultimately of winning a majority of the Labour Party. That must be our ambition in what we're going to do here. We want to get some politics that we can do that with. And of course, to highlight at the end of this, Tony Benn's contribution to working class republicanism in his ideas about a democratic and social commonwealth.
Steve, could I just ask you perhaps to stop screen sharing?
Oh, yes.
Maybe just ask, and then we can.
Okay.
We can see you.
Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry. There we go. That's better. Okay,
Lovely.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry to say. So the point we want to make is we're highlighting the republicanism that exists in the Labour Party. We're going to be able to criticise that and say why it's not strong enough. Let's say not clear enough, and also to highlight Tony Benn's contribution to working class republicanism and his ideas about a democratic and social commonwealth, because it's largely been forgotten. What Tony Benn did is been largely doesn't figure in. Benn's passed away himself, and it doesn't figure in that. So the term Republican Labour was one we invented to describe our working group, and so we first task was to work out what the heck it means. Why did we call ourselves that as an idea, even as a slogan? So the two things I think are: one, it's a description of a trend or tendency in the Labour Party, a current of opinion in the Labour Party. And secondly, we want to make it a slogan for the future. So it's about the past on one hand, but it's actually, we want to do it not just because we're historians looking at the past, but actually because we want to have a policy for the future. And Tony Benn, it's still in my opinion, is a giant of the Labour Party, so what we're going to try and do is to stand on his shoulders if we can, and stand on his Republican shoulders. It's not to say that everything Tony Benn said about republicanism is gospel, because he did his bill like 30 years ago, so something must have changed since then, obviously. But let's try and stand on it. Let's learn from what he did and try and better it if we can. That should be our ambition. The basic thesis, I suppose, would be this, that the Labour Party is a broad church of loyalists and Republicans. Now, I'm using those terms not in the Irish sense, because we often think loyalists and Republicans is like an Irish term for Northern Ireland and things like that. And try and use it more in an English-British sense, an Anglo-British sense. And whilst Republicans and loyalists is roughly an approximation for the left and the right, you know, the left tend to be the Republicans and the right tend to be the loyalists. It's not a neat one-to-one correspondence. I mean, I did work out that, I did find out somewhere that Roy Attersley, who was generally speaking a right winger in the Labour Party, he was something of a Republican, apparently. I don't know what, I haven't got much evidence on that. But just to give you that, the left and right don't neatly correspond on this issue. But generally speaking, the left are the Republicans and the right are the loyalists. So these two tendencies united in one party are not of equal weight or equal value, because the Labour Party is biased to loyalism. We could say that Labour Party was institutionally loyalist, meaning that it's built in or baked into the party as an institution, or to say it's got a loyalist bias or got a prejudice towards loyalism, because if you think about it, it makes sense. If the aim of the Labour Party is to become Her Majesty's government or Her Majesty's loyal opposition, that's how Labour is fitting into the system. The policy is really to carry out a non-Republican programme of social reform, you know, to improve the position of the working class, but not to tinker around, as it were, with the system of government. That's the assumption of it. And even if you look at Labour's clause 4, the Socialist clause 4, it doesn't really say anything about democracy, constitutional government in it. So that's gone missing from that anyway. I'll skip out what I was going to say about New Labour, but New Labour doesn't break with this institutional loyalism at all. But what it does is it breaks with the clause 4 idea that we should take things into public ownership, that we should try to nationalise the means of production. And he's gone back to free market capitalism, essentially, but still part of that institutional loyalty. Now, if you think of the Labour Party as a pyramid, okay, at the top of the pyramid is the Parliamentary Labour Party. And the Parliamentary Labour Party is much more loyalist on average than the base of the Labour Party. If you went to the base of the Labour Party, where working class activists are, you'll see much more kind of, I would call it, what would I call it? Implicitly, I suppose, the assumption of kind of much more republicanism amongst the Labour Party base. So in the pyramid, it's more loyalist at the top, and it's probably more Republican. It's a kind of probably. It's probably a dormant kind of republicanism. It's an instinctive. I think there's a kind of working class instinctive republicanism, which isn't really mobilized, doesn't really go anywhere particularly. But if you were talking to an average Labour Party member, you'd probably find many of them anyway, I don't know what percentage you would say they didn't like the monarchy, or they didn't go along with it. So Labour Republicans have really been hidden, in some ways been hidden from history. And I was thinking the other day when we saw this recent revelation of the First World War, where we used to see white European soldiers, and we didn't realize very much unless we knew stuff. There were hundreds of thousands of African and Indian troops in the war. And we saw the scandal of the War Graves Commission, where their deaths weren't properly recorded and they weren't properly buried. So there was a kind of institutionalized racism in the war. Now, what some historians are doing are digging out that history to show it always was there, really. It's there, but we didn't know about it. And our task, in a way, is to try to dig out some of the Republican history of the Labour Party in the same sort of way and show it's really always been there, even if we couldn't see it. Now, how are we doing time-wise, Carol? We're all right, yes, aren't we? We haven't gone very far. Okay. We did make one point in the group, which was a distinction between republicanism and anti-monarchism. And I think it's an important point in what we were working on as a group. And I thought of this analogy: supposing that we were all tenants living in a big house divided into flats. And supposing we discovered a load of old junk in the attic. Supposing there's a rusty old throne, I don't know, a crown and a scepter up there. And about a third of the tenants say, let's go up in the attic and clear out the old junk. Meanwhile, 2/3 of the tenants say, we can't be bothered. Okay. And they say, well, maybe we should keep these historic memorabilia. Every now and then we can bring the junk down, get dressed up, and have a jolly good party with music, dancing, and plenty of booze. So you can see it's quite popular to keep the junk in the attic rather than have to go through the effort of getting rid of it. But my point is this, really, that republicanism is different from anti-junk cleanliness, because republicanism is fundamentally about how the tenants are going to organize themselves democratically to take control of their living space. That's what republicanism is about. It's fundamentally, it's not what's in the attic really that's the key point, or even cleaning out the attic. Not that we should leave the attic in a mess, don't get me wrong, but republicanism is fundamentally about democracy and sovereignty and the tenants getting control of their living space and doing that. And too much of the time in the Labour Party, republicanism is seen as anti-monarchism, just cleaning out the old junk, and then why bother? So I think one of our big tasks is to get over this connection that we as Republicans are very, very interested in the democratic questions, whether it's in the Labour Party or elsewhere. Now, I wanted to go back. My next point was to go back before the Labour Party, and I'm only going to go up to Keir Hardie in mind and then open it up to Conroy. So it's worthwhile remembering, we talked about the 1890s, but before that, republicanism was quite an important strand in working class radical politics in the 19th century. From Tom Paine, for example, there was always a Tom Paine trend, which was influenced by the American Revolution, influenced by the French Revolution. And it went through the Chartist movement, which was very concerned about democracy. And the left wing of the Chartists, including people like George Julian Harney, who published a paper called The Red Republican. There were other Republicans as well. So republicanism was seen at that time as an alternative to the Whig Party, the Whig Liberal Party, you know, radical alternative to that. And there were two strands in this movement. One was the slightly more conservative strand associated with Charles Bradlaugh, and I don't know, there's somebody called I've forgotten his first name, but anyway, Dilke. And they had quite a lot of presence in the 1860s. There was a Republican movement in this country in the 1860s, quite a popular one, you know, and Marx himself was the other wing of this. Marx was involved in something called the Land and Labour League, which published a newspaper called The Republic. Okay, so there was that strand going on as well. And then what happened is that in the 1870s, this Republican movement died, more or less died out. For two reasons, I think, were picked out in this. One was the defeat of the Paris Commune, which had a very negative effect on radical republicanism in this country. But the second one was the reinvention of the monarchy of Queen Victoria in the context of a kind of popular imperialism. The Queen, who'd been, you know, out of public circulation, was suddenly reinvented by Disraeli and others to become the Empress of India. You know, it was a big fuss made. She's now the Empress of India. So this is in 1874. So all of a sudden, they realized, the ruling class, that the money was a kind of secret weapon to be used against the new rising trade union movement and the working class. If they could divert working class into this direction, that would be. So you suddenly got a popular monarchy all of a sudden, with crowds cheering in the streets and great celebrations for the Jubilee, Diamond Jubilee, Golden Jubilees, and all these other things. And a large section of the working class, anyway, a big section of the working class, thought, again, back to the monarchy and parliament, they thought that the monarchy and parliament went together, because now the working class had been let into parliament by getting the vote. They thought they could get representation in Parliament, so the workers believed their interests could be represented there. And the monarchy was seen, the Queen was seen, rather like a referee at a football match. You know, their job was neutral. She wasn't going to interfere with anything. It'd be a match between two teams, blue team and the yellow team, or soon it would become the blue team and the red team. And the monarchy was a non-political referee to make sure. That's how people saw it, you know, so why would you want to get rid of the monarchy? So the Labour Party, it's important to understand, therefore, was born in a period of declining republicanism and rising popular imperialism and general flag waving. So if you start to trace through, despite this decline of republicanism, which is going on, and the rise of imperialism, it remained an undercurrent imported into the new Labour Party from the earlier republicanism. And it was associated with the Social Democratic Federation, for one thing, and a little bit of the ILP as well. So we can trace this story into those organizations. But the key issues where republicanism appears to come alive again is where the civil list is being debated. How much money we're going to pay the Queen in Parliament. It has to be voted through in Parliament. That causes a dispute. Just before the First World War, where you've got the Curragh Mutiny and the King involved in that, there's another point of where republicanism appears to rise again. There's another rise in republicanism from 1917 to 21 on the back of the First World War, with the Russian Revolution, the Russian Republic, and so on, which was which was strongly supported by the working class. Then you've got the first Labour government, crisis over that, and then in 1931, the split in the Labour Party, by the way, which the King played a role in. In all of these moments of crisis, the monarchy is drawn into the political thing, and then this kind of republicanism sort of sparks up again a little bit. I'm nearly at the end. I'm just going to quote the civil list debate. Here's Keir Hardie, and I found a book which I forgotten I had, found it the other day. So I read this when the first thing, which I don't even know, Willie Hamilton MP, My Queen and I. He wrote a sort of quite a famous book that was known in some quarters, but he was just considered to be a maverick. Not, you know, he's because he was the only Republican in the Labour Party kind of idea, and people said he was mad and, you know, crazy and stuff. But the book's quite interesting, and he has a little quote in there. He says, let me just see if I can see that, page 97. This is Keir Hardie, okay? And Keir Hardie gets involved in the debate over the civil list in 1901. So Keir Hardie says, he declared, as a believer in Republican principles, he could not see any use for the royal family. It had become an anachronism. Court life was the centre of sycophancy and led to an unhealthy state of public opinion. Everything the occupant of the throne did or left undone, said or left unsaid, is eulogized and glorified as being of the highest wisdom. So that was the kind of speech that he made, and that was his kind of quite strong idea of putting forward a Republican kind of idea. Although he says at the very end, he concedes that the monarchies are quite popular with the working class. You know, that's the only slightly sit down bit at the end of that story. I'm not going to go, because looking at the time now, I'm not going to go on very much more. I'm going to cut short a little bit of what I was going to say so that other comrades can come in. I did look at the Social Democratic Federation. I looked at the Fabians, and I looked at the Independent Labour Party. And the simple messages, or I've got some quotes about those, but the simple messages, they all make Republican statements. I mean, not quite the Fabians, because they're not quite sure about it, can't quite make up their minds. They make Republican statements. And then, having made these Republican statements, they sort of say things like, well, we can't be bothered to do anything about it at the moment. You know, we are Republicans, but why bother with it? Let's do something else. You know, that's the general thrust of what they say, you know. And so that's the kind of declining republicanism, which was dying out from a more militant republicanism early on. It's carried into the Labour Party. and remains, as I would argue, a strand within the Labour Party right to now. The little paper we've done gives some other examples, and the one I haven't talked about, I hope other comrades will, is of course the contribution of Tony Benn. So maybe I'm going to finish at that point. So there, I think I will.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was extremely interesting. Can I ask comrades, if you want to speak, could you raise your hands, and then I can spotlight you and you can speak or ask a question of Steve. Absolute silence. You've obviously stunned them with all your knowledge, Steve. Because I haven't got any hands up now.
It'll go in a minute, don't we? Marie's going to come in now.
Oh, Marie. Okay, Marie. I will spotlight you now.
Yeah, unmute. Well, that was very good, Steve. This very it was probably quite difficult to put all this in such a short presentation. I'll come back to. I am amazed by the degree of power and role of the monarchy, by its very presence, like you have expressed, and that which you explain, the Labour Party is institutionally loyalist. I think that the LLA needs to come back to this, because all the problems we are having in the Labour Party, surely they are linked to this. It's not just that they are bad people who want the left out. It is the structure of Labour which is being challenged. And it is, to me, makes complete sense that there should be such a violent reaction from the structure. And it's not just the leader, I mean, comrades take the mick out of the Sir Keir, you know, but it's not just him. What we are studying here is the basic problem that comes when we are trying to change the party. And I think something that Steve said to me looks very important, is by its very aim, the party, the Labour Party, aims at being the alternative that can run the system. We can run it better and more humanely, but in the end, its aim is to run the system of government such as it is. And so therefore, like a hammer is made of a handle and the other part, because they fulfill this part fulfill the aim of hammering, then the party structure, which includes all its including its conferences, even the conferences, absolutely everything, everywhere you look at, it's a structure which is aimed at being the servant or the replacement or the improver, if I can say that way, of the system as it is, of the system of government as it is. So it's no wonder that we find that we are having almost a struggle against the loyalists, against the capitalists in the party. And it seems to me this needs to be much deepened in the LLA, because we need these things are, everybody knows them, they are, you know, they are evident, but if we do not study them, we get bogged down with little struggles and who said what and what Keir Starmer has said, and the false allegations, which in itself is very important to analyze. But why is it like this? And so I propose that in the LLA we continue and we develop a knowledge of how to be a current, a Republican current in the Labour Party, thanks to the vehicle of the LLA. I propose that comrades think of this and agitate and help others in the LLA and outside to deepen these questions. And I don't have a question, but I really do have questions. I just can't think of them just now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marie. Would anyone, Steve, do you want to come back on that, or would anybody else like
I
to
think it's anybody
contribute?
else to go. I'd rather let other people come in now, because I had a good swing at it myself, and I will come back obviously and comment. I agree with what Marie's just said there, but rather than saying that, you know, that's my aim, that we try to make the LLA into that. But I won't say any more. Let's take other comments. Sorry,
Right,
you're gonna get me going. That's what's
Larry has his hand up. Larry, I'll just spotlight you. And
there you go. Yeah, it's interesting, Steve, in relation to the Tony Benn principles that you raised. It's I think the job of the Labour Left Alliance is taking on board the understanding of republicanism through their education program, is because unless we challenge the loyalist perception of Labour within the Labour Party and the wider movement, we're never going to make any progress. And I think that the issue of raising the consciousness of a transitional republicanism into socialism has to be adopted on both fronts. We can't have the Labour Party with what is termed at the moment a popular front. It has to be a united front on class principles within the Labour Party, and I think that is, and the key to that is adopting in the first instance a republicanism approach to politics in our society as it stands at the moment, because unless we have that, we're always going to have the division within our own movement, because we're not progressing as a united front. We're progressing as a popular front, because the establishment, they're united, but against us, and we seem to be divided about where we're going. And I think that the issue of republicanism needs to be raised at all levels, you know, trades councils, the trade unions. And we had this discussion with Howard Beckett the other day, and he seemed to imply in his hustings meeting that he was in favour of federal system, because he was talking about Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England. And it seemed to me that given the right direction, that Unite as a union could take on the principle, if it's transformed from grassroots level to a Republican approach. And because the establishment is not going to give up without a fight. They're not going to hand over power to Republican thinking without some sort of grassroots support. And I think the understanding of republicanism coming through as a transition to socialist principles, because we do, and Steve's quite right, we mention socialism, but we don't actually say, well, what do we want from socialism? Because socialism is integrated with republicanism, as far as I can see, and vice versa. And that's the point I want to try and draw upon from the LLA discussions. Thank you.
thanks very much, Larry. Wise words indeed. Steve, you want to come back? Is it possible for me to talk? Is that all right, Steve?
Yeah, you should join. Yeah, please do. I want you to join. You can join in as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you see, it was very interesting that you said that all those societies that you talked about, well, not the Fabians haven't made up their mind, but all the other ones you mentioned, don't think it's, we haven't got time for it now. We haven't got time for republicanism. I happen to think that it's fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental. There will be no proper equality in this country until we get rid of the crown, the monarchy, the lords. They have to be got rid of, and all this ridiculous sirs and ladies and all the rest of it. It is absolutely fundamental to the change, the socialist change that we want to see in the country. That's been my opinion for a very long time.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carol.
Is there anybody else who'd like to speak, or can Steve, would you like to come back on some of that? Oh, Paul.
There's somebody
I
else.
would like to, but I can't raise my hand at the moment.
Oh, who is that? Sorry.
John.
I can't even see myself on it.
Okay.
John Truman. It's John Truman.
John Truman. Okay, I'll spotlight you. And Paul Collins had his hand up now as well. So John, we're looking for John. Oh, I can't find you at all here.
No, my camera's not working. It's I don't know why it's not working.
Ah,
but
okay. Oh, it's not working. Okay, all right, John. It's not working. I don't understand that. Perhaps if you go out of the meeting and come back in, you might be able to get your video to work. But anyway, let carry on, John. You carry on. Then it'll be and it'll be Paul Collins.
Yeah, I think it's been an excellent introduction. I do think that the perhaps another reason for the decline in the 1860s of republicanism was the start of the Long Depression around 1870.
Yeah.
Which obviously made a difference to the condition of the working class. There was growing unemployment as a result of that, short time for a lot of workers, and so it was bread and butter issues which dominated over that period. And the kind of circus of the Empress of India went along very much with that. It provided the entertainment and the spectacle to help people to endure what they were putting up with. I do think as well that there was a certainly, if not republicanism, there was a tradition dating from the Vienna Conference in the I think it was 1916 of democracy campaigners on the left in this country and throughout Europe, and that there's a really good article on this written by somebody from Manchester University, which I might have circulated in the past to members of the Republican Socialist Alliance, but I should have done if I didn't. But basically what the article says is it draws out this campaign, or this campaigning for greater democracy on the left, and it was sections of the left which weren't in the Communist Party, weren't in the Labour Party, weren't in the Independent Labour Party or any of these formations, and perhaps that provides some kind of a bridge which we can incorporate within the provides a greater sense of continuity. I don't think, although it would have to be researched, that any of the people and forces involved in this actually thought of themselves as Republicans, but they may well have done. But certainly they thought of themselves as socialists and Democrats. And in a way that neither the Labour Party loyalists nor the Communist Party members did. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Paul, Paul's hand is up next.
Yeah.
Paul, if you'd like to ask your question.
I apologize. I'm going to have to catch up with the actual talk on the video, but Carol's point was a good one, because that's exactly where I used to be. But it was only when I hung around with Steve, and well, it was mainly Steve, that persuaded me that actually, if you're going to have a socialist society, you've got to deal with the current echelons of power, such as the monarchy and the crown. And of course, I'm learning a bit more about the crown now. A lot of people use the term monarchy and the crown interchangeably, not realizing that there is a difference. And also, I was I was just interested in John's point when he mentioned about the group of campaign for democracy, that I was interested in the fact that he said that they may not have even considered themselves Republicans. So it's interesting how some people seem to regard republicanism as a kind of, well, a kind of hang up, I suppose. But yes, I'm persuaded that, yes, if you are going to, push for socialism, you've got to do it. You've got to be a Republican as well, because it's all very well pushing for these socialist changes. But I think I've said before, when revolution comes, if the royal family and the crown are still in place, that's going to be the obstacle, as it were. So yes, if you're a socialist, you should be a Republican as well, not just an anti-monarchist, if you know what I mean.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Paul. Diana has her hand up next. Diana, have you? Ah, there you are. I was going to say, can we see you so I can spotlight you? Hello.
I don't know whether it makes any difference, but I just think there's less data floating about if I don't have my picky up. Well, thanks to Steve. So I've always been anti-monarchist and Republican, but I actually never really known anything much about it. So I find what Steve says very informative. Also agree with Carol that we can't have equality in our society without getting rid of the royalist brats. They're above the law too in quite appalling ways, like the sandering of a state, shooting endangered species, and nobody does anything about it. I'd also like to know how politically neutral is the monarch. It's Queen Elizabeth at the moment. I'm very skeptical that she is that neutral. I'm also, where does power actually lie? I mean, all the real stuff that goes on is hidden from us. It's hidden what happens with the royal family, their views, their decisions. That's hidden from us. But then there's the corporations, particularly the transnational corporations. They seem to be the ones who really rule us. I'm wondering what is the relationship between them and royalty. This country's royalty, but our real rulers do seem to be the corporations. So we could get rid of the monarchy and be Republican, which, as far as I'm concerned, that would be a positive improvement. But we'd still have the corporations controlling us.
Oh, thanks very much, Diana. Yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? That's fantastic. Paul, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah,
and then I'll go back to Steve to maybe answer some of these questions.
On Diane's point, I'd like to raise a question on that point, actually. In terms of how neutral is the monarch, the current monarch, as it were, Perhaps Steve could answer whether, I could be wrong, but I thought I heard some sort of story in Australia in the 70s. I believe the monarch or whoever they have acting on behalf of the monarch actually overthrew the Australian Prime Minister at one point, and he was apparently replaced by somebody else. I don't know if that was true, and if it was, could you tell us a bit more about it?
Right, sorry, Celia apparently is, thank you very much, Paul. Yes, that's quite an interesting one. I hope Steve can tell us about that. That's a really good point, Paul, thanks. Apparently Celia, sorry Celia, I didn't see your hand up. Are you able to raise your hand electronically?
I guess, am I muted?
No, we can hear you good and loud. I'll replace
Okay.
the
No,
spotlight there.
I was going to ask a question. I wondered to what extent the crown could exist without the monarchy.
Interesting one, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question, yeah. She's like, I think it's time to go back to Steve now, and
I'll start on that last one.
And let him answer some questions.
That's an interesting point, that last one, because the theory we've got implies that it sort of could, that you could get rid of the monarchy, but the crown power would still be there. But it would be like having the monarchy, it would like the crown being naked. In other words, its whole rationale, the power that it had would be open in front of us. You know, there wouldn't be the idea of monarchy to sort of cover it up. It would be like putting the whole thing out in the open. What's the justification for doing any of the things that the government is actually doing? So I think what it would do was, the Queen went, people would think, well, it would be a massive change, even though formally it's just one person going away. It would be a psychological, cultural bombshell, to be honest, if it happened. But I think that initially, the old ruling elite would still use the crown power, still try to keep its hand on the crown power, even if the Queen wasn't there. You know what I mean? To try to get that back. So the crown power of the state won't disappear by the Queen going. But if the Queen goes, the state power has lost its rationale, its own kind of justification for how it is. So it would be a very dangerous place. You know, what would the army do? Who would they be loyal to? And it raised so many questions that time. I don't know if that really answers your question, but theoretically, the state could exist. Yes, the state power could still exist, and probably would initially. You know, even in Russia, when you think of the example when they got rid of the Tsar, you know, that power didn't just disappear at that point. It was still lurking around for a little bit, quite a bit after that. So there is more to doing it. But when the Tsar had gone, everything's up for grabs, as it were.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Sorry, you did say that just the Queen existing as the Queen was important to keep the crown together. Yeah.
Yes, I think yes, because in a way the Queen is a symbol of crown power, and my analogy would be like having a company. I think the power is like a corporate power, and the chief executive who's running the show is the Prime Minister, right? The Queen is like the chair of the board. Mm-hmm. So obviously she doesn't really manage anything day to day, but the chief executive, Boris Johnson, goes to visit her every week to discuss whatever's going on. We don't know, it's a secret what they do, it's absolutely confidential. So maybe they're talking about the weather or something. I don't know what they're doing, but I don't suspect that's the case, right? So, and that's the kind of relationship that Johnson's the chief executive. He couldn't be the chief executive if the system wasn't what it was, if he wasn't the, you know, the chief executive of the company, as it were. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let me try to go back. Sorry, let me just look back to some of the other things that comrades said. We haven't talked much about Tony Benn, which, you know, we need to do, but it is in the paper. At the end of the paper that we produce, and we're going to circulate, we've got all the bullet points and some of the people who's, I'll maybe say something a little bit about that. But I really agree with, first of all, I agree with what Marie said about the importance of us deepening our understanding of these questions and making the LLA a vehicle for changing the Labour Party, actually, you know, because in a way, the LLA is a kind of defensive, we're in a defensive situation where the left is under attack and the LLA is under attack, you know, with members being expelled and all those other things. That's a sign of you being on the defensive. But I still think republicanism is a kind of counterattack, if you know what I mean. If we became more strongly Republican, we would have a way of addressing the rest of the left and a way of challenging things. If we get our republicanism, you know, right, get it scientifically based or whatever you want to express it. So I agree with Marie on that. Larry made the point which he's made before, but it's to me a key point when he talks about transitional. It's like transitional demand. To see republicanism as the road towards socialism, you know, it's the route towards it. And if we don't deal with republicanism, we're not on the road. You know what I mean? We're not on that road. We are hanging around trying to improve things. That's what we're trying to do. But we're not on the road to something better. That's the way. So I think the way Larry expressed that, I'm completely in agreement with him on that. I did have a quote, which I don't know if it fits in here. There's one I had, which is a red Clydesider. And this gets the nub of the matter. This red Clydesider, they tended to be Republicans. They tended to be on the left of the Labour Party in the 1920s. And John Wheatley was one of those. He did get down and bow to the king at some point, but he makes a statement. He says, I wouldn't lift a finger to turn a capitalist monarchy into a capitalist republic. So he's, you know, if it's not socialism, we're not having it, kind of thing. That's what's the point in it, is kind of what he's saying. And the interesting thing is, it's repeated by Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee says the same thing, but Clement Attlee is a monarchist, right? So he uses the same phrase as a loyalist to defend the monarchy. What's the point in doing? The really point is, what's the point in it? Why bother? If we only end up with a capitalist republic, is there any point in it? But Larry's point is key to that, because Larry's point is that this capitalist republic isn't the end of the road, it's only on the way to something else. It's on the way to a challenge to capitalism, and therefore it's not merely changing the form, it's not simply the way they like to put it, well, we'll have a president instead of a queen. What's the difference in that? But that's not really how it would and how it has panned out if you look at historical examples. John added a point, an important point, which I didn't have in mind, which is the importance of the crisis of capitalism that was going on in the 1870s, as well as the rise of imperialism, as well as reinventing the monarchy. That impact on working class struggle and working class consciousness of capitalist economics. Diana said, how politically neutral is the Queen? Well, I don't think the Queen is politically neutral. We don't know because it's a secret, but I don't think that she would be. Well, why would she be? You know, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, obviously that the neutrality of the Queen is the essence of the ideology. We can tolerate it because we have to believe that she is neutral. She doesn't involve herself in politics. And yet she's the most experienced politician in the country. I mean, she's been doing this job for I don't know how many years, 60 years or something. She knows every prime minister. She gets all the secrets. She knows where all the bodies are buried. She's got more knowledge and influence, etc. and being very important. So why wouldn't she? The thing is that she's not going to let us know. There are odd times when it comes out, something comes out. David Cameron famously said he rang up the Queen when we got the Scottish referendum results, and the Queen jumped, I can't remember that word, the Queen jumped for joy. You know, that's not a non-political Queen, because she saw that the Scottish referendum was defeated, the Union would remain, and her position would remain strong. So there are little times when you get a glimpse that something's going on, but by and large, we don't see it. And that because if we saw it, we wouldn't put up with it. You know, if we found out that was going on all the time, we'd think it was all completely corrupt. Where does power lie? I think Diana also said, well, I think political power is concentrated in the crown, which is the state, really, at the end of the day. It's the form that the state takes in this country. you know, it's the arm. And George summed it up in a previous discussion when he spoke about the armed forces and the civil service and these institutions of the crown institutions of power. That's where the power is. And the monarchy is a kind of distraction, makes us not look in that direction. It makes us look at Buckingham Palace when we ought to be looking at the Treasury, ought to be looking at what's going on in Whitehall, what Boris Johnson's doing in Downing Street, and so on and so forth. Secrecy is really important because monarchies depends on secrecy. We don't know, and the secrecy is very strong factor in the way we are governed. And I think of this example, usually when there've been injustices like the Hillsborough tragedy, it takes something like 30 years before these injustices are put right. There are lots of examples of these cases, 30 years. To me, that's a measure of how undemocratic we are, because everything's kept under wraps and put away from us. We still don't know what happened in the miners' strike over the pickets at where was the pickets? I can't remember now. But anyway, remember the miners' pickets, and lots of other examples. The blood products scandal, the people who had infected blood. It takes us a long time. See what happened to those post office workers, again, because of secrecy. They were pursued, and it was years before anybody found out what had been going on. So secrecy is one of the big problems of this system that we have. And Queen's consent, I'll just finish on this point here, that Queen's consent, the Queen has to consent to things. If there's anything that affects her influence, it has to pass through this thing called Queen's consent. And I mentioned that when Tony Benn wanted to move his bill for his republic through Parliament, he had to ask the Queen's permission. He had to ask her to give her interest, as it was called, to Parliament so this issue could be debated. And one of the things that the Queen's consent comes out in those Guardian articles is that the Queen has got investments. And what are those? If we knew where the Queen's money was stashed, maybe she's getting profits out of your company or somebody else's company. We say, oh, she got shares in this, she got shares in that. She got shares all over the blooming place. If we knew that truth, we would view the whole thing as something much more economic. We'd think, do you know what? The Queen's got economic interest in all of this, not just purely political ones. Paul mentions the case of Australia when one of those cases where the Governor General, who works under the Privy Council and so on, removed Gough Whitlam, I think it was Gough Whitlam, from office. He never got it back into office. They were managed to they wouldn't do that very often, by the way, because it means that possibly Australia might become a republic at some point. It's not, you can't use that shot in your locker. You just use it once maybe, and then maybe you won't keep it. Although Australia is still still under the crown, it's still linked to the crown, linked to the monarchy as one of the 15 countries that are. I can't see. Celia got to me. Crown exists without. I've got without. No. I think I've just answered. I started with Celia's questions. I've answered that one. Hopefully, I've answered, comrades, most of your points. But more, I'm happy to have more.
I think, yeah, that was very, very, very good answers. We have some hands up. Peter Morton first, and then Larry, and then Mari. So I'll just highlight Peter. Have you got can you put your camera on? Ah, great. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chair. This isn't like fully formed in my mind. I'm still working on this in my own head, sort of thing. But I think it was Diana or Dan earlier on raised the question of like basically the global power of the capitalist corporations and that sort of thing. And to me, this is we're as socialists, we're involved in trying to locate the struggle of working class in relation to the power of capital and how to, like a phrase I like to use, at least to subordinate the interests of capital to the democratic will of the people. And this is an aspect. I mean, this is or even to overthrow the power of capital. And this is what the socialist struggle is about. So how does that relate? How does the Republican struggle or the Democratic Republican struggle relate to that, because that's what that's what we're trying to win socialists to, and the left of the Labour Party to. I mean, in the first instance, we're basically I'm a member of the Republican Labour working group in the LLA. We're basically trying to win the LLA, a wider circle than us, to trying to win the left of the Labour Party to republicanism, an even wider circle, the left of the Labour Party, and beyond that, then beyond that, the working class. So I think the hook there for us is to win socialists to republicanism, and the relevance of that in the struggle against capital, and to win the left of the Labour Party to that, in order to win the working class to the idea that, first of all, the working class can come together and overcome the power of capital, which in many respects, in all the daily struggles we're involved in, that they are part and parcel of that overall struggle. That's what we're trying to, win consciousness to that kind of historic struggle that really we're all part of. So I think an important aspect of what trying to win people to a democratic Republican program, as it were, has got to involve the relevance of that to the working class gaining control over capital, standing up to capital and the capitalist class. So that is something that I think we need to work on integrating into our like campaign for republicanism on the left, because to me that is what's going to hook socialists to republicanism, to win socialists to republicanism, when they can see the relevance of republicanism, democratic republicanism, to that struggle. And therefore, I think as part of that, we have to defend national democracy, because that's basically where democracy, as a way of running things, is that's where it is. And in terms of global capitalism, that is under national democracy is under great threat, and you can see that within the context of I think this treaty they were trying to develop in a few years previously, and trying to establish across Europe and United States TTPI or TTIP. That kind of like to some extent fell by the wayside, but it was said that'll come in the back door through some treaty involving Canada. And then there's the Trans-Pacific Treaty that they're all talking about now. And these treaties are all about limiting national governments and what they can actually do, in terms of, can't we vote in a government that will nationalize an industry? Well, that will, these treaties, the idea of these treaties is to curtail that power, that democratic power to do that sort of thing. You will then be, national governments can then be taken to international court and fined and told they can't do it or whatever. So in that sense, global capitalism is trying to subordinate national democracy to their interests, and obviously that is part of their MO, and that's what capitalists will always try and do. So we have to locate a democratic Republican program within that context, and how this is what's required in order to stand up to the power of international capital. So it's in these different ways that I think we can attract socialists on the left to actually see the relevance of democratic republicanism. And so I'll leave it at that.
That's you made some excellent Excellent points there, Peter. I have Larry next. Larry, could you ask your question or make your comment?
Yeah, I'll raise the issue of the comrade who raised the point of the Queen being neutral, and Steve's response to it in saying that it's like an illusion or secret. The question is that the Queen is neutral, and she's neutral in as much as that she's defending the establishment. It's only when the establishment is exposed and challenged by a Republican socialist principle that the illusion will be swept away, and she will be exposed as where she stands. The other point is that and the laws of the land tend to apply to us in general, but when it comes to inheritance tax, and I'm diversing a little bit here because it's an interest of me, is that the Queen's mother inherited a vast amount of jewellery from Mrs. Simpson when she died. Now, if I was to inherit it, I would pay inheritance tax on it, but the Queen Mother didn't. And this is the contradiction in society as we stand today, because the inheritance is transferred through the crown and the royal family, if you like, without any hindrance from common law. Anyway, that was just an aside, that little bit. It's just something that irritates me.
That's a very interesting aside, actually. I think it's a very important one. We've got Mari Lynham next. Mari? You're still muted, Mari. You have to unmute.
Yes, I wanted to say a little bit more about Tony Benn, as had been suggested by Steve. Just to make the transition, I'll note that this Jerry Hassan is called Jerry Hassan. He wrote "The UK is not a fully fledged democracy, an alternative history of Britain," and that was written on the 14th of April of this year in the Scottish Review. And it is a mighty document where he shows how the abolition of plural voting dates of 1969-70. So there was already quite a racket going on in the way of electing people to Parliament until just a few years ago. And then he notes that there's a secret interference of the monarchy. Is there something speaking? No. Secretive interference, he says, in decision making at government level. You can see it in the way the Queen or the King then, or the Prince have got a prerogative by which they can, like Steve mentioned, it's not assent, it's consent. These people must give their consent to any bill that comes to Parliament. And so with Tony Benn, the Queen gave her consent before, not the assent afterwards, the consent before. And don't think that this consent is automatic and just a routine, because it isn't. Charles has stopped hundreds, I don't know if it is hundreds, he's stopped. Prince Charles vetted 3 parliamentary acts which prevented tenants of the Duchy of Cornwall estate, the tenants cannot buy their houses. And this is still going on now. And he has the ability to veto this before a bill comes in. And the Queen in 1973 I'm quoting this because this is a thing that we know about, but countless other things are secret and we don't know about it. In 1973, she stopped a company's bill which proposed corporate transparency measures to Parliament. And so she stopped that thing because it would have disclosed, it would have obliged her to disclose the ownership of her shares, the ownership of the shares of the Crown. I've explained myself very well. That's in 1973. Now we know about it because somebody found out, but this goes on all the time. And of course, I think in the matter of Tony Benn, she gave consent because she knew very well that the bill was not going to be accepted. So it was just as well letting it go. But to go back to Benn, I would like to just mention, because perhaps there is not so much time now, that he explained why he proposed this bill. And he said, by the end of the 1970s, he said somewhere that his views had shifted to the left of the Labour Party. He attributed his political shift to his experience in cabinet in the 1954 to 70 period in the Labour government. And he noted 4 reasons for his shift. How the civil service can frustrate the policies and decisions of popularly elected governments. So the civil service can frustrate the elected governments. The centralized nature of the Labour Party, which allows one leader to run the party as if it were a personal kingdom. The power of industrialists and bankers to get their way by the use of the crudest form of economic pressure, blackmail, and other methods against a Labour government. And the power of the media, note this is back in 1970, the power of the media, which, like the power of the medieval church, ensures that events of the day are always presented from the point of view of those who enjoy economic privileges. So I think there is much more to be said about all this. I would like to just briefly go through the point of this bill, the Commonwealth of Britain Bill, which was quite a revolutionary thing to do, really, and extremely brave to present this in Parliament. He introduced it in 1991. So as I said, the Queen gave her consent because she knew, and they all knew, that it wasn't going to be accepted. In fact, it was just, Ben was treated like Corbyn multiplied by 1,000. He was accused of wanting Eastern European sort of communist state in Britain and that sort of thing, which was vitriolic. His points, because of shortage of time, I'm just going to go through the points. The monarchy would be abolished and the constitutional status of the Crown ended. This is a summary. The Church of England would be disestablished. The head of state would be a president elected by a joint sitting of both houses of the Commonwealth Parliament, which means, the actual government, the Parliament. The functions of the royal prerogative would be transferred to Parliament. The Privy Council would be abolished and replaced by a Council of State. The House of Lords would be replaced by an elected House of the People with equal representation of men and women. The House of Commons would similarly have equal representation of men and women. England, Scotland, and Wales, and by the way, the Commons would be the House of the People, not the Commons. England, Scotland, and Wales would have their own devolved national parliaments with responsibility for devolved matters as agreed. County court judges and magistrate would be elected. British jurisdiction over Northern Ireland would be ended. The judiciary would be reformed and the National Legal Service would be created. The constitution would be codified and in an amendment process established. And the voting age would be lowered to 16. MPs and other officials would swear oath to the constitution, not to the crown. And then, of course, there's much more to be said. I think we should go back to this in a future meeting because this is a subject for several hours study. But just I want to cut the matter short by raising a few things which I found.
Marie, time is getting on. This is explosive stuff and it's brilliant. But if you could just, because I have got one more person with their hand up.
Okay, I'll give a conclusion then. Tony Benn noted that the IMF was in a position to demand for a loan that it had given, that there should be cuts should be made. And this all was done and there was no debate. It was just all agreed in this secret, opaque circle where nobody knows who is exactly the boss. And there is obviously a connivance like we have seen on the picture for this meeting. Did you see Cameron who defers to the Queen and the Queen? There is a relationship there and all the prime ministers more or less have followed this pattern. They are getting their power from the Queen and from the crown. Yeah. Finished.
Wow, that's amazing, Mari. Absolutely amazing. Can you imagine if that had gone through Parliament? That'd be fantastic. Jennifer has had her hand up for a long time. Jennifer, over to you. You need to unmute, Jennifer. Jennifer, you need to unmute yourself, please.
I'm not sure how coherent I'm going to be here, but something Peter said made me think that there is a real problem with the royal prerogative being exercised in respect of trade deals, and it's obviously a very current problem. The trade deals are negotiated under the royal prerogative under a procedure called CRAG, and it's all on the Parliament website and available to read. But basically, it prevents parliamentary discussion of trade deals. So trade deals are done in secret without parliamentary scrutiny. But at the last minute, there is a procedure for ratification, which doesn't provide for parliamentary discussion. All it does is say that the deal is to be laid in Parliament and it's laid on the table for 21 days. And during that time, an objection can be made to it in the Commons. If an objection's made, there's no debate. The government can simply refute that objection and you get a prolonged series of sort of ping pong games where in the end, the government will win because everybody will get weary of it. And so effectively, there is no scrutiny of the kind of deals that woman is going around the world allegedly negotiating with people, making Australian diplomats sit on hard chairs and so on, and congratulating herself on getting a wonderful Japanese trade deal, which is just a cut and paste affair, which leaves us in a worse position than we started out in. And so these concerns about TTIP-like deals are very, very concerning indeed because of the ISDS, the International Dispute Settlement Procedure, which, as Peter said, actually overrules the rights of a sovereign government to do what it wants to do. And there are a number of cases around. So it's very worrying that we don't actually have control over trade deals. The other issue that I thought we ought to look into at some stage, and I'm sorry I haven't done anything on this really, is the whole business of land. And how it's been shared out, how much the Crown owns, which is massive. And also somebody made the point tonight that if we're talking about oppression, it's not just the Crown, it is big business. And big business is getting more and more ownership of land that used to belong to the people through the public ownership of things like water. A lot of the gathering grounds have been sold off. Schools, a lot of school playing fields have been sold off. Hospitals, a massive amount of hospital land that used to be public is now in the private sector. And so there's a whole issue around all of that, where as the Commons, we have less and less ownership of land and less access to it. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
An excellent 2 points as well. Yeah, land. I'm really glad you brought that up, Jennifer. We have Paul. Paul has his hand up again. I think we've got to make this the last question and then go back to Steve to get his answers and conclusion. Right, Paul, over to you.
Jennifer touched on a subject that's quite close to my heart. I feel quite strongly about land. Not so much the ownership, it's, well, for me, the ownership of, well, one of the things I feel very strongly about is the need for land value tax. And I think instead of, because once I got interested in the concept, I find it astonishing that we tax individual income, we tax consumption, we tax buildings, but no one ever talks about taxing land, which of course is provided by nature. You can't produce more of it, unlike everything else. For me, the question, if we had a land value tax that was regularly assessed, I don't think the question of ownership would be much of an issue, because the value of the land would be, you know, the value would be public. You know, it's about getting the increased value of the land to make so that it becomes, so in a way, the value of land become public without even need to deal with whether it would be need to be nationalized or anything like that. It's really about the usage. And yes, the one way to deal with land is to obviously introduce a land value tax.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Excellent point as well. Wow, we've had some really, really good contributions here tonight. So Steve, there's no more hands up. Steve, can I go back to you now? And so that you can conclude and answer any questions.
Try to summarize all those some great points that comrades made. And one of the interesting things that now, I won't say at the minute, there's an interesting point that came out from a number of contributions. Pete's point, I think, was important, that in a sense, it also came up via what Larry was saying, is how we understand what is the relationship between republicanism and socialism. And the way to think of that is to think about the relationship between democracy, because if we're arguing democracy, you know, republicanism is about highly developed, extreme democratic form of government. And that doesn't have to remain at the level of pure politics. You can have that democracy in the workplace, for one thing. And if we had a very democratic system of politics and economics, it wouldn't work if everything was still in private hands. You would be driven to see, do you know what? This private money is being taken out of the country, or businesses are being, you would be driven by the logic of the situation to extend public ownership. It would be the thing that flew. So republicanism leads to the need to socialize our economy. We couldn't just leave it in private hands and be very democratic, because otherwise it would make sense. We've got a democracy, and yet there are these people who own everything and deciding everything. It just doesn't, it's a complete contradiction. So the mere act of extremely democratizing our society, what in itself doesn't mean socialization, but it leads to that point where people see that, you know what, we cannot leave all this wealth in the hands of these few people. And that goes back to Larry's point about republicanism leading towards, I won't use the word socialism as if it's a system. I think I prefer to think it as the socialization of property, the bringing of property into public control and accountability. I won't think that socialism is some kind of national system of or something like that. But it's about who controls the property and has that economic power, which takes me on to Marie's point and some other points that are probably linked together. Marie's point when she spoke about Tony Benn, and obviously we're going to discuss this. Marie said we need to discuss Tony Benn. We need to find out more about Tony Benn's ideas, as Marie said, and she gave everybody, all of us, an idea about some of his points. But I think the first point that Marie said when she talked about the civil service and the centralization of power into the party, the things that Benn picked out, the 4 points that he picked out, is to remember that the crown is not the queen, but it's a system of political power. And the press is part of that. You know, we couldn't be thinking republicanism without thinking the press needed to be reformed, for one thing, because I think the press is actually part of that system of power as well. You know, and I think as socialists, we already know that's not working. But what the crown does, it allows the state to reserve things, take those things out of our control, either by secrecy, because we don't know about them, or by having them decided elsewhere, which I think was Jennifer's point about TTIP and things like that, where these trade deals can be signed off through crown powers and never really get to be debated. Perhaps the Parliament will just Parliament will have the job of just rubber stamping it. You know, tomorrow there's a bill coming through Parliament. Will you turn up and raise your hand in favour of it? I mean, that's about the amount of scrutiny we'll get, because it's being done under those powers that exist in the state to do that stuff behind people's backs. And that then leads us on to these other issues that came up of tax, inheritance, Larry's point, and land. Land is, and Jennifer raised that, because land is also there's a great book actually on distribution of land. I don't know off the top of my head, but I will bring that to the group's attention at some point. That's the one. Jennifer's got it already. Fantastic. Who Owns England? It's a brilliant book. You know, Jennifer, you agree with me on that? It's a great book, that. Yep, I've got the thumbs up. And it shows in that book how land is connected to the environment, and it's also connected to housing. All the housing issues that we have are also tied up with the way that land is controlled. So we've got tax, we've got land, we've got trade deals. So republicanism is not just pure politics. It appears to be as if we're only talking about constitution and politics and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to these economic questions, of our ability to solve economic questions if we don't have democratic power in the first place. So we need to get that democratic power so that we can address these economic issues. It sometimes appears that all we're talking about in Republicans is about the Constitution and stuff like that, so we're not really interested in the things that affect people's lives, but that's completely false. It's because we realize that these political things are the things that are preventing ordinary people, working class people, of getting control of their lives. That's why we have to deal with the politics and not think we can solve it just by trade union action or just stuff on the ground, which is part of it, by the way. Don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking that, but what I'm saying is on its own, it doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't get us to the problem. Larry's right to me. Larry's got something about inheritance. Is annoyed about inheritance. He's quite right to me, I'd say. That's how I finish up and say. We should all be more angry. That's what we need to be. We should all be a little bit more angry. I've really enjoyed the meeting. I've enjoyed everybody's contributions. And the good thing is, although we haven't got a big audience, we've only got 12 people, we can have it as a YouTube. So I hope other people will look at it. And we're going to do something like this again. But obviously the idea is that the group will have a discussion about the next issues, and then we'll try to bring it then to a next event. You know, that's the kind of way we're working. And we will soon be sending out our little paper on what is Republican Labour, so that the rest of the LLA members can do it. We've got a big, if there's only 12 people here, we've got a big job to convince the rest of the LLA. But I mean, we're all tired with too many Zoom meetings, so I'm probably not surprised we haven't got the masses banging on the door. But anyway, there's enough of us here to spread the word, let's hope. Thank you.
Yeah, I found it immensely interesting. And not only your introduction, which was brilliant, but also all the contributions from the comrades have been so excellent. I've really enjoyed it. Well done, everybody.
Thank you, Carol, for coming in to chair. We might get you to do another one for us. Well, chair another next one maybe as well.
It would be a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting now.